Today we're here to hear from our director and our curator who've worked on this exhibition for the past summer. It's an amazing exhibit, and they will give you more insight into the art and the mind of Ferran Adria and elBulli.
Good morning. It's Dr. Jeffett and I are going to present this today, and it's partly about Ferran, but it begins with a sort of a run through the Spanish relation to food in art.
It's a great pleasure every once in a while not to have Peter or Joan or Dirk or Annette or Shayna present these, because it gives our chairs a little rest, because when William and I speak, there are just a few people who come, and when they speak, the facility staff has thanked us and wants us to do a lot more. So we're going to split this up. I'm going to do the introduction and then turn it over to the curator of the exhibition, Dr. Jeffett. So William, you're welcome to help me with my notes, or you could find a chair close by. All right, thank you. Okay, so food, Dalí, Ferran, in the tradition of Spanish art. And as we know, Dalí was very oral and saw a conflation of food, sexuality, art, communication, and it was very much a part of his persona. Here he is, not just as a very slender, shaved head young man, but you can see on his head is a sea urchin. And he's demonstrating this kind of amalgam of the organic with the person, which will characterize one of his interests. I think the conflation of art and clothing and sexuality is quite clear. And for Dalí, also, food was part of his public persona. The ubiquitous bread loaf, for example. But this comes out of a tradition. This is not just Dalí's innovative spirit. There's a tradition of interest in food, but in the composition of natural materials, which we might consider still lifes, and then a subcategory in Spain that we'll discuss called bodegones. But the still life is an interesting concept. It's an interesting term because it vocalizes this amalgam of the interest in what is organic and alive and what perishes. So this contrast of life and death. And if we look at the language of still life, in English we say still life, and I think German is Stillleben. Stillleben. Thank you. And so again, emphasis on the stillness in life, but in French, of course, it's nature mort. Any French people here? I will stand corrected. Nature mort, nature dead, right? Naturaleza muerta, still life. So that concept is in the work. Now, when Dalí starts making still lifes, I think he's doing them from more of an academic approach. He's making a very nice composition, using the traditional elements, the food on the table, the wine. But you can see he's bringing in the cloth that will be symbolic and interesting. And then when he's making a gesture towards cubism, of course, he's really using the food for an aesthetic purpose rather than a spiritual one. And really that's in many parts of our Western tradition, that is the way that food and nature in the still life is presented. So In this Caravaggio, this Italian still life from the 17th century, it's really decorative, it's buoyant, it's life-affirming, it's very pretty, but you don't have the sense of any terrific symbolic weight. And another Italian, of course, Arcimboldo, where he's using a kind of conflation of personality and the vegetal. Conviviality, sweetness, acidity, bitterness, these are words that we use to describe foods, but also human personalities. And he's doing this in a visual way. Now we start getting serious in Spain. You'll see this nice, wonderful tulip on the left, and it's alive, it's dewy, moist. And on the right, of course, is the hourglass, ticking away the time. And just so you don't miss the point of this memento mori, dead center, we've got our universal fate. This is a still life by Menendez, and although each of these bodegones will have a memento mori, a reminder of death, as a subtext, they also they achieve this in a different way. So in this Menendez still life, you see that the tomatoes almost have an extra light to them. There's a glow, and there's a sense of purposeful alignment of these, as though they were almost subscribing to an external order that wasn't imposed by the artist, but by nature. And now, with Sanchez Cotan, probably the highest expression of this bodegon tradition. The term bodegon is Spanish for the cellar, the larder, where these vegetables are kept. But of course, this is not painted in the cellar. With Sanchez Cotan, you start noticing some really remarkable things. For instance, it's framed in a doorway. Now, the window or doorway does visually frame the subject, so you see that kind of counter-reformation, focus and discipline in the image. But it also starts to suggest the altar. You can see that flat plane and the vegetable materials laid out in an arrangement that seems to have, I can feel the golden mean in this. I can feel that proportion phi in the distribution of these elements. And you see also that they form this wonderful curve, which almost could be part of the arc of the Fibonacci curve, as these vegetables are ordered and even ascend. So the suggestion of ascension is really interesting. So look how precise the outline of the melon, for instance, is. It has a kind of crystalline gleam, and I think the term crystalline is really useful here. The crystalline versus the organic, the mineral versus the organic, that which has a form and an architecture that is perpetual, that is dependable, which does not perish, the crystalline and the mineral, versus the organic. And in what's, for me, one of the most incredibly beautiful still lifes imaginable, I actually saw this painting, and it's even more breathtaking than it appears on the slide. So the Spanish critic Francisco Calvo Serrayer said, from this perspective, the bodegone of Sanchez Cotan, with their mixture of geometry and expressiveness, space and time, and idealization and naturalism, eventually came to constitute an inescapable historical model. And that is, the historical model here is using the natural world to both demonstrate its own temporality, but also to hint at the eternal, the timeless. And so we have this sense of eternity and the perishable moment simultaneously, life and death. Now, I think Dalí in 1926 participates very, very intensely in this tradition with the basket of bread. And like a Counter-Reformation painting, there's the very dark background to focus our attention, not waywardly on the beauty of the world, but on the subject which has its symbolic meaning here. The bread representing the body of Christ, and the shroud, the veil of Veronica, which he will have fun with later. And having hold that last Sanchez Cotan, one of the last two in your mind as you look at this other still life. And here we have the architectural and the temporal, permanence and flaccidity contrasting here. And he's having a bit of fun with this as well. It's not just time that melts. So we're talking about these two qualities, the mineral and the organic, a strange and prodigious dialectic between the living and the dead. And certainly Dalí is using architecture in support of this, developing this contrast. The amazingly architectonic structure of that building and the perspectival diminishment towards the horizon, setting up the sense of vastness and permanence, and then this least permanent thing of all, the fried egg, being suspended in the middle. And Dalí's interest in food and that contrast between architecture and the temporality of the egg is something that he wanted to make permanent in his foundation there in Figueres. And again, the shroud, the glowing of the loaves, the glowing of the fish in this Eucharistic still life, again, contrasting a spiritual life with a physical life. And this painting, which we always love to rail against the critics as an example, this is the painting in the National Gallery in Washington, which is always voted the favorite by the public, favorite work in the collection every year, but which the curators raised in an era where Dalí's politics disturbed academia, usually hide the painting near the drinking fountain or on a stairwell. But you can see, again, the use of architecture, and this is Dalí's ideal form, and Leonardo's ideal form too, the dodecahedron that surrounds the Last Supper, and you can see the transcendent, the immanence, transubstantiation is occurring, and the world is becoming insubstantial at that moment. And again, the architectural or the eternal, the use of phi here, the golden rectangle, by which Dalí set up a series of interstices inside the picture plane to align his objects, which are shown to have this incredible balance which suggests eternity, while in fact this is the briefest of brief moments where the swallow is caught in flight and the bottle spills and an apple is in two places at once, according to contemporary physics. And now food used to express deep social issues. This is the premonition of civil war, in which Dalí shows civil war as auto-cannibalism, an organism actually digesting itself, cutting itself apart and eating itself. And at the base, of course, the baked beans or the boiled beans, which is part of the title, again, Dalí bringing the larder into the painting to show this moment. Dalí loved the social elements of food, and here when he had his entourage in the 60s, you can see everyone's having a fine time. And we mentioned the communication and food and communication. So here's the sardines next to the telephone receiver. In the background, time frozen with the jump roping girl, and yet the sardines essentially past their prime indeed and shriveled up next to this communicative device. And this, of course, the sexuality of communication and food all conflated together. To answer that phone, you have to pick up the receiver and put the sexual end of the lobster to your mouth. So there's this tension of sexuality, communication, and of course, involving food. Now, Dalí liked to have a lot of fun with his ideas, and of course, the more fun, perhaps the more serious in terms of our acceptance of it. So he's enjoying this conflation of food and sexuality. Who doesn't enjoy looking at this painting? It's just great fun. And we're starting to see a little bit of the confluence between Dalí and Ferran here. This is the flatware that Dalí created out of with motifs of mollusks. And of course, he did make a cookbook, as you know, Les Dîners de Gala. And in it, he worked with the Parisian chef or restaurateur Maxime, and they made very elaborate dishes. This is Veronica's veil, which Dalí now will have fun with, and put it next to a chicken that presumably was going to give its imprint, but instead we got Christ's. And this construction of food, very Bruegel-like, with dead bodies at the base and the mollusks rising, the conflation of life and death again. And what could be more joyous than this terrine with toothbrush and gleaming collage teeth? So I'd ask you, as Dr. Jeffett now talks about this beautiful show he has curated and installed, to consider this crystalline and the organic, the timeless and the temporal, which comes out of this very serious tradition of the bodegón and that spiritual aspect of the physical world. So let's welcome Dr. Jeffett.
Okay, let's see. Well, the sort of association between Ferran Adria's approach to cooking and art and sort of broader cultural issues, many of which Hine pointed to, is something which has been noted in the past. He was compared by the New York Times to Dalí, going back quite a few years, about to around 15 years ago. A chef to rival Dalí. And also around the same time as the restaurant took on a great sort of sense of fame in the 1990s in particular, Adria was included in the important big exhibition of contemporary art that happens every 5 years in Germany in Kassel called Documenta. Even though he was not an artist, he was at that particular year the only representative of Spain. And when they did that exhibition, there was also, and you'll see in our exhibition, a reference to that, a film where the British conceptual artist Richard Hamilton talks about Adria and his restaurant elBulli. And there he likens the inventiveness of Ferran Adria to Marcel Duchamp. And of course, Richard Hamilton was a great sort of admirer of and hugely knowledgeable about Duchamp's work. And like Duchamp, Richard Hamilton spent time in Cadaqués, and this is a kind of cultural link geographically that ties them together. Hamilton did things like he recreated Duchamp's large glass, and he came out of sort of British pop art. And his idea is that what Adria does, and you'll see in the exhibition, in the video, and I'm not going to show you video today, that he suggests that what they're doing is reinventing vocabulary, and he gives the examples of Duchamp and also in literature Shakespeare. So the idea that language is being reinvented, and so maybe we can look at ways in which this concept of reinvention is parallel to Dalí and particularly interesting. The restaurant had a longer history than Ferran Adria. It goes back to the 1960s, and also in the exhibition you'll see a video that shows what it was like in the late 60s. Super 8 footage that was taken around 1968. It's the oldest known sort of representation of it. And it started as a kind of tourist destination, and very kind of modest, but it kind of grew into a restaurant that was focused on the French Nouvelle Cuisine with a French chef. And it kind of gradually built up a significant reputation in the phase prior to Ferran's entry into the restaurant. And it must be said that Ferran's kind of way of cooking, though it's extremely different and innovative, comes out of this French tradition of Nouvelle Cuisine, which was meant to take the basis of the French tradition of cooking, but to approach it in a lighter and different manner, to get away from this sort of very heavy traditional sauces and butter-based cooking of the high French cuisine that was so typical before, and also to kind of change the atmosphere of the presentation. And these were ideas that Ferran also worked with. And the restaurant is called elBulli, which refers to bulldogs, because the original owners liked bulldogs, not because Ferran Adria collects bulldogs. But he's really developed it into a kind of brand identity in many ways, associated with this idea of innovative cooking. And he starts working there at the beginning of the 1980s and fairly rapidly becomes head of the kitchen. And by around 1990, he becomes, with a partner, Julie Soleil, the owner of the restaurant. And it's really from that phase and towards the end of the 80s and beginning of the 90s that it really sort of takes off in a new direction. And one of the aspects of it is looking at the French Nouvelle Cuisine, but from the specific kind of geography of where they were located, which is a very rich, as Hank pointed out, sort of geographic site with things like sea urchins on your doorstep, which not all places in the world have. So the really, really interesting primary materials in the immediate area, and also mountains. So you have both seafood and game, and in general, that whole sort of kind of Mediterranean basin is very, very interesting. But this particular neck of the woods is curious, and has always had, at least for 4 or 5 centuries, pretty interesting food and food traditions. And of course, the radiation of certain types of food through the world came through that sort of focal point, not uniquely, but at the beginning. We shouldn't forget that the history of food is interesting, and certain products we assume are basic came from very far away initially, and they came to places like Barcelona because chocolate, tomatoes, potatoes all came from the New World, and it was the Spaniards returning from the New World that brought these plants and products back to Spain, and from there they irradiated through the rest of Europe. So I mean, basically, you have to imagine that in Italy, prior to the 15th century, they didn't have tomatoes, which we think of as the basis of Italian cooking. So some of these things are quite modern, and relatively speaking. So what the Romans ate is very, very different than what we think of as modern European cooking. The geographic location of the restaurant is very, very close to Dalí. It also is in a kind of site which has certain similarities. It's a protected area. It's in a natural park, and it's only a few kilometers down the coastline, although to get there physically you have to drive a slightly longer distance because you can't drive down the coast because it's a rocky coast part of the way. And the road goes in a different path. Now, during this phase I'm discussing that starts in around 1990 until the restaurant closes in 2011, they achieved enormous success and 3 Michelin stars, as well as all sorts of amazing recognition in the sort of culinary press. He was on the cover of the Sunday New York Times Magazine, and they were saying he was the best chef in the world. So whether that's true or not, I don't know, but he was a very, very innovative chef, and there's a certain point to be made about the way in which he approached the problem of cuisine and its sort of evolution, and that was through a kind of constant process of innovation. Here you can see how really close the two places are within the sort of context of Spain. So what Adria did with the people he was working with, because it was a kind of large operation in lots of ways, was basically something that came out of culinary practice. It wasn't completely abstract. There was a great deal of experimentation, and the words like avant-garde have been used to describe his approach. But it was anchored in culinary practice. And in reality, what that meant was to avoid repetition, so that during a season, which was for them half the year, they would each season develop a new series of dishes. And then they would close the restaurant and spend the other half of the year developing next year's menu. And that involved lots of things. It involved experimentation in a kitchen that they had, a kind of laboratory kitchen where they could play around with new ideas and new ways of presenting things, but also sourcing the ingredients and finding out whether those ingredients really were going to be available when they would need them in terms of their seasonality, their availability. Things like fish, you can't just assume because you can find it in January that it'll be there in August. So a great deal of thought went into the evolution of these menus, and the byproduct of that was over the years 1,846 dishes, new dishes that were evolved over that period of time. And curiously, they documented everything from their working, cooking notebooks to photographically documenting everything. So there's a kind of archive of the history of the 1,846 recipes, which is a kind of odd way of thinking. You know, normally I think when you in many restaurants, there's not this kind of obsessive documentation. So not only were they working all the time, developing all these things, but they were, you know, they were keeping records of what they were doing, so that if they had to go back and recreate it, they could do that. And sometimes accidents provoked new ways of thinking. Then Hank mentioned the sort of whole still life tradition, and in some ways, what they were doing is about sort of transformation. So transformation in two senses. One was we have associations and memories in our mind about how we think the kind of textures and tastes that we associate with particular food ingredients, and they went to great lengths to modify some of those so sometimes you know, something that we associate that has a kind of thick, dense texture would become much more liquidy or light, or that something that looks like something we have associations with is really something else. So it's transformed in terms of its taste experience, but also the way in which they presented things was very thoughtful and very striking and suggestive of forms that we may not always associate with food. And in many respects, they were looking at associations with the natural world. So in this sense, it's a bit like still life. And this idea that the sort of dish is frozen in time, of course, is reinforced through photography or through, in some cases, video, as you'll see. So this interest in nature can be seen also in these presentations. And Dalí, with his fascinations with soft architecture and with Gaudi's architecture, was also exploring, you know, taking the rigidity of and sort of rectilinearity of most architecture and looking at it from another point of view, very much, as I said, inspired by Gaudí and this idea of these forms coming out of nature. So in Ferran's case, and you'll see in the photography in the exhibition, I'll just give you 2 or 3 samples here. You can see how a dish looks like leaves or a form that refers to butterflies is achieved, or flames of fire. So these were very sort of striking transformations of materials to evoke a specific form out of nature, not a geometric form, but an organic form. This reference to nature was pretty key in his work, and he also would use different fruits or other items directly out of nature to create containers or vessels for the presentation of certain dishes, in the way that, you know, in some ways, like a mussel is the first spoon in the history of elements and utility. They also, due to the complexity of the things they were creating, would design their own cutlery and serving dishes. This similar again to Dalí. Here you can see more of these natural references, or the famous sea urchin. And so not only are there these cultural references going on in his work, but this striking presence of the organic and the sort of non-geometric way of presenting things. So not only did they go to great lengths to develop these menus every season, what we're talking about are sort of tasting menus of around between 30 and 40 dishes in a dinner that would go on for 2 to 3 hours. And it was pretty complex both to prepare and to present, because if you have sort of 35 dishes, and the waiters get distracted, and you have to wait for 30 minutes between plate number 25 and 26. Things are not going well. So they needed around 40 cooks to set up a dinner for a total of 50 people, and around 20 or 25 waiters as well. So and from a kind of business model point of view, it was a pretty unusual operation. Not necessarily financially sound, and I think the aim of the exercise was basically to present the absolute best in the best way possible. So strangely, it's a kind of almost anti-business model, and so consequently various business schools have done sort of odd analyses of it. It's so quirky. So they did lots of things that are kind of anti-intuitive, like they would only take reservations in advance, so nobody who turned up would be admitted no matter what. Usually they were booked up 2 or 3 years ahead of time anyway, given that they were closed half the year, and given that there were only 50 seats in the restaurant. So there were lots of odd things about it, but it gathered this reputation, not only because of the 3 Michelin stars, as really being such an extraordinary experience that there was this odd demand for it. So it was, in the latter years, it was literally constantly full and booked out very far in advance. Just to reinforce the sort of association, but it's not one, as I said, it's been pointed out by other people in the past, and it's not one that's just made up either. It's not just a metaphor, because as you can see here, on the right is a presentation of one of the dishes where Ferran makes a kind of gesture to Dalí, and one of Dalí's paintings on the left, which is in the exhibition, and that Hank's already mentioned. Of course, Dalí did his tableware, which is also in the exhibition, and Adria came up working with designers with very, very specific servingware for these special dishes they created, and also different sort of plates that were really custom made for very specific things. This will give you an idea of the sort of setting of one of the tables. So it wasn't the old-fashioned heavy French, 4 glasses and 8 pieces of cutlery spread out across the table. It was much simpler and cleaner, and much less formal in its presentation than that sort of traditional French cooking. So the emphasis was on what you were eating, and these sort of series of experiences that you had going through this tasting menu. And this will give you an idea of what the kitchen was like. This is a kind of annex to the to the building. The restaurant itself, the dining room, was fairly sort of rustic and traditional. And this was a sort of area of transition between the kitchen and the dining room, where they prepared everything to be served. You can get a sense of the absolute sort of coordination that was necessary for this very large team of people to prepare these dishes and get them out and not lose the rhythm of the presentation. As I said before, there was great emphasis on documentation, and we've just pointed to that in a very sort of simple way in the exhibition with a small selection of some of the sheets from the different years where they've kept all of their working notebooks, where they developed their ideas, this idea of the archive, so important to them. And this has led them to, as they say, elBulli, the restaurant is closed, but elBulli continues. And it continues as a sort of foundation that's in a kind of transition of evolution, but they're building on the same side as the restaurant a kind of extension of it, and it's going to transition to a kind of foundation that will be open to the public in about 2 years' time. As well, they have a space in Barcelona, which right now is functioning as a kind of office space, but which will house the archive. So all of the history of the restaurant will be located in the foundation in Barcelona, and the other will be very much their future projects, and partially an outdoor museum display. So they're developing lots of interesting new ideas around the questions of food, food culture, food history. One of them is called Bullipedia, which is a kind of Wikipedia of food and the history of food going back to prehistory. So they're working with these large teams of people from all different disciplines to develop their thinking about innovation, the history of food, ways of presenting it, and it's still very much under development. But they're looking at a number of different ways of operating along those lines, and all of that's sort of notionally targeted to be available in 2 years' time. And this will give you an idea of, this is one of the most privileged tables in the restaurant, so you can get a sense of the sort of rustic feel of the actual building itself, and this sort of simple presentation of the tables. And this photo is quite intriguing because it has a little Dalí reference in it again. So the connection to Dalí wasn't lost on them. Again, there's this little Venus de Milo with drawers miniature version there sitting and lurking in the background. It's not totally clear if Dalí went to elBulli. It's possible he did, maybe in the phase prior to Ferran's time there. But of course, by the late 80s, Dalí was in pretty bad health and wasn't going out to dine much. Just to give you an idea of the size of the team, here's a group photo of them in the years not too long before the end of the restaurant. Ferran himself, and with the wonderful elBulli kind of image, which now proliferates in many different ways. And then finally, this will give you an idea of the exterior of the building, and as I said, their future project to develop this foundation, which I think will be a really exciting and amazing thing. It's been an amazing project to work on, and I suppose now would be good. Maybe we could both answer questions if anybody has any.
So what did it cost to dine?
Well, I don't know exactly, but I don't think it was horrific, but it wasn't cheap. I think it was in the region of region of $250 or something per person. I don't know about the factor of the wine, which might have changed that. I mean,
Did Ferran Adria leave any recipes of his with the Dalí cafe?
yes, he did. Yes, he developed, or he's allowed us to use his wonderful recipe for lobster gazpacho, which is also in the catalog. So if you want to try to make it yourself, it's one of the recipes that's within the realm of the pragmatic, and you can try it in the restaurant. The other thing about on the sort of tasting element is because all these sort of photographic materials and video are so kind of cold in a way, and it's very hard to kind of recreate what a sort of dining experience was like, given there's so many different factors that come into play, smell and taste and so on. There's a tasting of jamón ibérico in the gallery, so that you can get a little taste of Spain to complement the presentation of the exhibition.
The reason I had 42 chefs, was this because when they were closed for 6 months, they all collaborated on different recipes to do?
Yeah, but also, I mean, I think they needed that many people to produce what they were cooking as well. So both, yeah, and when the downtime, they would spend all the time coming up with new ideas and sourcing ingredients and things like that. And
they depended, like a lot of restaurants depend on interns. So not all 42 collaborated. He had a core of half a dozen people that he trusted. They would work together, and then there would be a new crop of interns who would get initiated into the elBulli style. Then they would be graduated and go on to other restaurants.
yeah, and so there's been a huge impact so many people that passed through elBulli went on to set up their own very prestigious restaurants following in a similar direction. Anybody else? Well, thank you very much.